So welcome. My name is Annabelle Edward, and I am your digital communications coordinator here at the church this summer. If you don't know what that means, just think social media. On that note, if you are not following our social media, I would highly recommend it. We have both Instagram and Facebook, and I have heard they're really good. So, woo! So, just a thought as I'm up here. Anyway, let's jump into our passage this morning. So, if you have a Bible or a phone, flip through to Luke 8:40 to 56, as that is what we will be reading this morning. Jesus heals a bleeding woman and restores a girl to life. Now, when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were expecting him. Then a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house, because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. As Jesus was on his way, the crowd almost crushed him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." While Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," he said. "Don't bother the teacher anymore." Hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid. Just believe, and she will be healed." When he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her. "Stop wailing," Jesus said. "She's not dead, but asleep." They laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But he took her by the hand and said, "My child, get up." Her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. Then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astonished, but he ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened. When I was in elementary school, I tried out for the girls' baseball team, along with all of my friends. It was a small school, so nearly everyone who tried out for a team would get on, except me. Year after year, in fact, for 3 years in a row, I didn't make this baseball team. And I felt left out, like I didn't belong. I tried so hard each year, and yet it never was quite enough. Looking back, it's actually quite funny, but at the time, little Annabelle was really sad. She felt left out, maybe even a little outcast. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm sure we have all had our fair share of experiences like this. Maybe you did make all the sports teams in school, but when you moved schools, you felt outside of the in crowd. Or walking into a new church, not knowing anyone, you felt like an outsider looking in. Or maybe you feel like this with your family, or a friend group, or in a new job. Or maybe you just know the pain of rejection all too well. The feeling of being left out, outcast, hurt. We have all felt like this at some point or another, and we will probably feel like this again. This is exactly why when Pastor Grant said I would be preaching on Luke 8:40 to 56, I was excited. This passage had been one that both intrigued me and I found powerful the first time that I read it. Now, there are multiple reasons for this, but the main component of this was the contrast seen in the text. Mainly the contrast between a woman, unnamed, unknown outcast, with Jairus, a synagogue leader, wealthy, respected. The feelings and situations that we have all felt and experienced at one point or another is exactly why we find this passage so powerful. We're introduced to two people, a prominent man, Jairus, one who is seen as everything good and noble in this world, and a woman, completely cast out, at the very bottom of society's hierarchy. And yet, Jesus meets them both. And in doing so, completely flips the script of these norms, and society blows up the idea of insider versus outsider, upends the way that we know and understand the world, changes the game, just like Jesus always does. Let's unpack that today. So Jesus turns a private moment into a public one. This woman, she has been bleeding for 12 years. 12 years. Labeled unclean, untouchable, dirty. In every sense, she was equated, as N.T. Wright puts it, with a corpse. As he writes, two of the most obvious sources of pollution in that time were corpses and women with internal bleeding. She couldn't have a husband. She couldn't have kids. For all intents and purposes, in this time, she was seen as useless. Further, with being labeled unclean, she couldn't be near others, let alone a holy man, as in that day, customs dictated that though her physical condition wasn't contagious, in a ritual sense, it was. And yet she pushes through the crowd to touch Jesus' cloak, makes her way through these great crowds that Luke makes no mistake in mentioning. In fact, he goes as far as to say that the crowds almost crushed Jesus in verse 42, which really paints a powerful image of how great this woman's faith and bravery truly is. To brave this crowd just to be able to touch the edge of his cloak. In a deeply private, desperate act, this woman comes to Jesus with what is most likely the end of herself. She knows that going into this crowd means she will infect others with her impurity, will infect Jesus with the act of touching him, a man that even the synagogue leader bowed to. She would have known the consequences. As N.T. Wright says, the risk of rebuff of the crowd, of the synagogue ruler, and of Jesus. And yet, she still goes. At the end of herself, after 12 years of bleeding, going from doctor to doctor in pain, separated from her community, she approaches Jesus, unnoticed, unseen, but with the strength and bravery and faith that if she could just touch him, she would be healed. What could this faith look like in our lives? This desperate, at the end of ourselves, faith. She didn't come with anything. No expectations for a man that in her mind shouldn't want anything to do with her, with the intention to disappear healed, but still invisible. Yet Jesus doesn't let that happen. That's just not who he is, because he knew that physical healing was only one thing this woman needed. Jesus stops everything, even on his way to what is arguably more important, a dying little girl, someone who doesn't have time, with a father who is most likely anxiously urging them to go faster, desperately trying to get him there in time to save his daughter. Jesus still stops, takes time, and sees this woman. He's Jesus. He knows who touched him and why. He knows the outcome, knows this woman, and knows that she has already been physically healed. So why does he stop? Why does he ask, who touched me? Because in doing so, he brings a private moment into a public one, something hidden into the light for everybody to see. Not to shame her, but to see her, to call her daughter, to bring her home, to make her visible in a time and a place where everyone would love nothing more than for her to be invisible. He stops because her life doesn't change without him stopping. Yes, she would be physically healed, but that's not all she needed healing from. And physical healing, while a part of him, is not the reason Jesus came down to earth. No, without him stopping, she would not have been spiritually and socially healed as well. Without him stopping, she would not have been seen to be clean, allowing her to come home, allowing her to be whole. As again N.T. Wright puts it, Jesus shares the pollution of sickness and death, but the power of his own love, and it is love, above all else that shines through these stories, turns that pollution into wholeness and hope. Wholeness and hope. What do you need wholeness and hope for today? Many of you have most likely at some point felt shame, fear, hurt, outcast and unseen. Maybe you're feeling that right now. Whatever your situation, I have good news. We have a God who sees, a God who knows, and a God who stops. Just like he restored the woman, just like he made known to her that this healing was in no way an accident, he too wants to restore you today. Going back to the passage for a second, though, we see that Jesus' day is not at its end. Because while he's taking time to see this woman, someone else is watching the clock. Jesus turns a public moment into a private one. Jairus has no time. He's desperate. His daughter is dying, and Jesus just stops. Like this is a leisurely stroll and not a life or death situation. Not like this is a father at the end of himself reaching out in desperation. The amount of anxiety he must have been feeling, not only for Jesus stopping, but having to tackle the sheer presence of this crowd. He knows that the clock is ticking down on his daughter's life. And yet with the crowd, that verse 42 literally uses the word suffocating to describe, impeding progress, and Jesus stopping, he sees this time running out. Jairus probably stood there anxious and impatient, trying to get Jesus to his daughter faster. This is not the Monday morning traffic anxiety you feel when you're on your way to work and you're like, oh no, I'm going to be late. No, this is the anxiety you feel when you see a loved one on their deathbed. Jairus is trying so hard to push through this crowd, to just get there in time. And yet he doesn't. He didn't. Time ran out. As he finds out, just as Jesus is finishing talking to this woman, his daughter is dead. There's nothing more he can do. It's over. All that anxiety, desperation, fear must have all come crashing down. The conflicting feelings this man must have been feeling is hard, maybe impossible to imagine. Maybe he was thinking, if only he did not stop. If only the crowd let us through faster. If only. Jesus sees this. He sees him. He knows him and he understands him. Jesus still has perfect timing. Even when we, like Jairus, question why it feels like he is too late, when we cannot possibly understand how he can still move in spite of a situation. I mean, Jairus just heard that his daughter is dead. His hope is gone. Every normal human being would know that this, her story, is over. Even those around him understood this, for they told him, "Don't bother the teacher anymore." But it's not. Jesus is still there. In the midst of this crushing storm that Jairus is going through, Jesus is there. He tells Jairus, "Do not be afraid, but to believe in his daughter would be healed." Again, probably not something Jairus wanted to hear at that moment. Probably not something we wanted to hear if we were in his shoes. But this is not Jesus telling Jairus, "If you only believe a little more." No, this is Jesus calling Jairus into a deeper dependence, a trust in God so profound that he puts all he understands away and gives it to God in trust. Trust in his timing, trust to take his anxiety and desperation, trust that Jesus has got him and his daughter. Not an easy feat for any of us, but let's not forget that Jairus is a synagogue leader. One that should have had it together, one that should have been able to save his daughter himself. Yet Jesus is calling Jairus to humble himself, put faith above his own understanding, and see where Jesus leads. And Jesus leads differently, that's for sure. As when they get to the house, Jesus only allows 3 disciples and the daughter's parents inside. Probably not something all the mourners and great crowds were hoping for, yet exactly what was needed in this situation. Because Jesus is ultimately in control. He is the calm authority in the center of all situations. Jesus flips the script. Yet unlike interacting and touching a bleeding woman, he flips it by allowing no crowd, no spectacle. Just the girl's parents and his 3 closest disciples. What had been a very public moment became an intimate moment of resurrection, new life, a public moment turned private. Jesus takes the theatrics out of it. For he doesn't want this miraculous, and it is miraculous, resurrection of a girl to overshadow who he is. He doesn't want a crowd to just see the signs and wonders and not get who he is or why he is here. Not for spectacles, but to bring wholeness, bring peace, bring restoration, and to show care, as demonstrated with him asking for the girl to be fed as soon as she was up again. Not only to care for her, but to bring her parents out of their state of fear and joy and into a task of helping their daughter. He shows care and love, brings peace and restoration, and yet makes it abundantly clear in doing all these things, even ordering those present not to speak of what had happened, though I doubt that lasted longer than an hour because the dead girl was up and walking. But that though this was amazing, this was not a spectacle. This was not a trick. This was not a magic show. Instead, it was an intimate showcase of Jesus' great love and care for his children. How he will meet you where you are. Jesus restores our peace. Now, this does not mean that this is not scary. In fact, it is quite obvious in both interactions with the woman and Jairus that they are scared. We see clearly how much fear this woman is experiencing in verse 47, as she came trembling and fell at Jesus' feet. or how fear and anxiety are haunting Jairus both before and after learning of his daughter's death, as Jesus himself mentions it. And yet, the woman still went to Jesus. Jairus still brought him to his home with fear and faith. They went. Because yes, God wants to work through us and in us to bring us out of detrimental fears that grip our hearts. But that does not mean that we can't start afraid. That we can't run to him afraid and desperate. Because sometimes it is our desperation that pushes us towards God. And we see clearly in these passages that these two were desperate enough. Jairus, a synagogue leader with all his many resources, had failed. He had failed to save his daughter himself. He was so desperate at the end of himself that he went to a man that for everything they were probably hearing about in the synagogue was at best crazy, at worst blasphemous. That's desperation. And the woman, desperate enough to brave a crowd, one that is disgusted by her, deems her unworthy, won't touch her, with all the consequences beating down on her if this doesn't work. That's desperation. That's faith. Because Jesus calls for faith. We see it in both these stories, how the woman's faith heals her, and how Jesus calls the man to faith that his daughter would be healed. Again, this is not easy. They both had to do things that were uncomfortable. Jairus had to humble himself. The woman had to reveal herself. And yet in doing so, God worked in unexpected but miraculous ways. Because God moves in response to our prayers. He hears our desperate calls. He feels our pain and he knows our heartbreak. He is the God of salvation. A word that literally means at its root, wholeness of body, mind, and spirit. He takes our uncleanness and restores us once more. Remember when I said at the beginning of the sermon that one of the two most obvious sources of pollution in this time was a bleeding woman and corpses? And that it was a very understood no-go. You do not touch anyone that could fall into these categories. Well, Jesus touches both of them in the span of one day in this passage. Not only that, but Luke mentions his instances like this quite consistently. Last Sunday, Justin preached on a man that Jesus called demons out of, who was also deemed unclean. These stories written together by Luke is in no way a mistake. It showcases spectacularly who Jesus is at his core. He is a man who flips the script, shakes it up. He is preparing people for this flip. He does this by touching them. Those deemed unclean, dirty, polluted, he takes their uncleanness and restores them. He takes our uncleanness in order to make us whole once more. As Isaiah 53:4 says, he took up our pain and bore our suffering to bring salvation, to bring restoration, to bring new life. Jesus restores our peace. Maybe physical, but more than that too. As though these stories are about physical healing, they're not about that at all. Just like I could never actually end up on that baseball team, even though I worked and I hoped each year, so too do we not always get the physical healing that we so desperately hope for, that we pray for, long for. And I can't answer the question of why. It is something that many have and still do wrestle with. However, I can tell you that Jesus restores our peace. He wants to and does bring wholeness and hope. He wants to restore our peace in spite of fear, in the midst of brokenness, our peace during struggles. Jesus' peace meets all situations. Like his peace met the fear of both the woman and Jairus, he wants to meet you today too. Let me end with one final thought. Luke is using these stories very strategically. He is preparing us for the climax of the gospel, the whole point of the New and Old Testament. Luke is writing the ultimate foreshadowing for how Jesus flips the script during the crucifixion, where Christ becomes desperately unclean for us to be healed, where Jesus takes all the sin, all the shame, all the brokenness and suffering, everything unclean, to bring us into wholeness. Jesus embraces our uncleanness to restore us in salvation. Isn't that amazing? Let's pray.